I'm sitting in a parking garage at 11 p.m. with my engine off and a manila folder on the passenger seat. I've been sitting here for 40 minutes. I know because I watched the timestamp on my phone go from 10:19 to 11:02, and I haven't moved once. Haven't called anyone. Haven't cried. Haven't done anything except stare at that folder like it's going to change what's inside it if I wait long enough. The folder belongs to Sadie. She's 26. She's been with Forge and Meridian for 14 months. And 3 hours ago, she pulled me aside in the hallway outside the accounting office. With the look of someone who had been rehearsing what to say for days and still wasn't ready to say it. She handed it to me with both hands, like it had weight beyond the paper. She said, "I don't know if I should be doing this," and then she walked away before I could respond. Inside the folder are 2 sets of financial documents. Both say Forge and Meridian across the top. Both cover the same 11 years, same company, same revenue lines. Different numbers, not slightly different, structurally different. Like someone built a second version of our finances and ran it quietly alongside the real one for over a decade. I built this company with my bare hands and a partner I trusted completely. We called each other brothers. We missed weddings, funerals, and vacations. We shook hands on equal footing 11 years ago in a subleased office with 2 desks and 1 client. I gave that partnership everything I had. The folder is telling me something I'm not ready to hear yet, but I already heard it. I put the car in reverse and drive home. Tomorrow, I will find a lawyer. Let me tell you who Derrick Hale was before I knew who Derrick Hale actually was. He was the guy who called me at 2 a.m. during my father's hospitalization just to stay on the phone. Not to talk, just to be there. He was the guy who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to help me move equipment into our first real office space, because we couldn't afford movers, and he said, "That's what you do." He was the guy who gave a toast at my wedding that made my mother cry and my father shake his hand for a full 30 seconds without letting go. That's the version of Derrick I operated on for 11 years. That's the file I had on him. And that file was so thick, so detailed, so full of real moments and real history, that I never thought to open a second one. Forge and Meridian started in 2013 in a subleased corner of a marketing firm that felt sorry enough for us to give us 2 desks and a Wi-Fi password. We had 1 client, a regional logistics company that paid us $4,200 a month for operational consulting, and we split everything down the middle. Every dollar, every decision, every late night. That was the agreement, and for the first 2 years, it genuinely was. Derrick was the face. That was natural, not assigned. He was magnetic in a room the way some people just are. The kind of person who made clients feel like they'd known him for years within 20 minutes of meeting him. He handled the pitches, the relationship dinners, the investor calls. He wore it well, and he knew it. I was the engine. I built the operational frameworks, managed the delivery teams, designed the systems that actually made our clients money. While Derrick was shaking hands at rooftop events, I was at the office until midnight making sure everything he promised actually got executed. I didn't resent it. Division of labor made us effective. I believed that completely. By year 3, we had 11 clients and 6 employees. By year 5, we crossed 7 figures. By year 8, we had 31 staff, 3 service verticals, and a reputation in our market that took genuine sacrifice to build. I missed my son's first birthday because of a client crisis. I missed my brother's graduation. I took calls on Christmas morning and answered emails on anniversary dinners, and told myself that's just what building something real costs. Derrick made the same sacrifices. I watched him make them. Or I watched what I believed were the same sacrifices. I now understand there's a difference between a man who sacrifices and a man who performs sacrifice while quietly keeping score in a ledger you're not allowed to see. He called me his brother in every room we ever walked into together. I believed him every single time. That belief is what made everything that came after so precisely, surgically effective. It was a Saturday in October. Derrick and Lauren hosted these dinners 4 or 5 times a year. Good food, good wine, the kind of evening that felt effortless because Lauren worked hard to make it feel that way. I'd been to enough of them that I stopped noticing the details. That was my first mistake. There were 6 of us that night. Me and my wife Claire, Derrick and Lauren, and 2 couples I didn't know well. One was a friend of Lauren's from college. The other was a vendor Derrick had recently brought on. Comfortable crowd. Easy conversation. The kind of evening where nobody says anything important and everyone leaves feeling warm. We were somewhere between the main course and dessert when it happened. Lauren was refilling wine glasses, and someone asked how Fortune Meridian was doing. Casual, cocktail party interest, the kind of question that expects a 2-sentence answer. Derrick gave his usual response. Growing, strong pipeline, exciting year ahead. He was smooth about it. He always was. Then Lauren put her hand on Derrick's shoulder and said, "He carries so much. People don't realize he basically runs that whole operation." She said it warmly, proudly, like a wife who genuinely means it. I was sitting 4 feet away. Claire's hand found my knee under the table. Not squeezing, just landing there. She felt it too. Derrick laughed it off, the way you laugh off a compliment you secretly agree with. He said something like, "We both do," and redirected the conversation. And the moment passed in maybe 8 seconds. The table moved on. Someone made a joke. More wine got poured. I smiled. I participated. I finished my dinner, helped clear plates, and said goodbye at the door at 10:30, and told Lauren it was a wonderful evening because it was the thing you say. In the car home, Claire didn't bring it up immediately. She waited about 4 minutes, past the neighborhood, onto the main road, and then she said, that was a strange thing for her to say. I told her Lauren just meant it as a compliment toward Derrick. Claire looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the road and said, "Sure." That one word sat in the car the whole drive home. The thing about a comment like that is it doesn't detonate immediately. It doesn't feel like a revelation in the moment. It feels like a splinter. Small, ignorable, not worth the effort. You tell yourself Lauren misspoke. You tell yourself it was the wine. You tell yourself 11 years of equal partnership doesn't get rewritten by one sentence at a dinner table. But the word Carrie stayed with me. Not loudly, not urgently, just present. Like a door left slightly open in a room you're no longer sure you fully know. I didn't understand yet what was behind it, but I stopped closing that door. I want to be precise about what happened after that dinner, because it wasn't dramatic. There was no single morning I woke up suspicious. There was no confrontation, no dramatic pivot. It was quieter than that, and because it was quiet, it was more devastating when it finally assembled itself into something I couldn't ignore. It started with the cars. Derrick drove a blacked-out Range Rover he'd bought 18 months earlier. I'd driven the same Audi for 6 years because I kept telling myself I'd upgrade when the business hit the next threshold. I never thought much about the gap. Derrick was flashier than me by nature. That was just Derrick. But after that dinner, I found myself doing math I'd never done before. His house had been renovated twice in 4 years. He'd taken Lauren to Portugal, to Tokyo, to a private villa in Sardinia that I'd seen photos of on Lauren's social media. His kids were in private school. His wardrobe had quietly become the kind that didn't have price tags visible. None of it was impossible. We built a good business. But I started holding it next to my own life, and the proportions didn't quite match. Then I started paying attention to the meetings. There was a category of meeting I'd been excluded from for years that I'd accepted without question because Derrick always framed it the same way. Investor relations stuff. You know how they get. I'll loop you in on anything that matters. I'd nodded and gone back to operations because that was my lane and I trusted him to manage his. But I started pulling calendar records and cross-referencing. Some of these meetings had been happening quarterly for 3 years. Some of the names I didn't recognize. None of the outcomes had ever been looped back to me. Then the expense reports. I'd never audited them closely. That was Derrick's administrative territory, and our accountant signed off quarterly, so I assumed clean. But I pulled 12 months of operational expenses and sat with them on a Sunday afternoon. and something felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. The numbers weren't outrageous. Nothing screamed fraud. But there was a softness to certain line items: consulting fees, operational infrastructure, travel and logistics, that didn't match what I knew we'd actually spent. Numbers that were slightly too round. Categories that were slightly too broad. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself the dinner party had gotten in my head. I told myself 11 years of trust didn't evaporate because of one offhand comment from a man's wife over a glass of Bordeaux. But I hired a forensic accountant anyway. I told Derrick I was doing a routine financial review for a potential credit line. He said, "Good idea, long overdue," and offered to pull whatever documents we needed. He smiled when he said it. That smile is the thing I keep coming back to now. Sadie had been with Forge and Meridian for 14 months when she found it. She wasn't looking for it. That's the part that still gets me. She wasn't a whistleblower. She wasn't on a mission. She was a 26-year-old junior accountant trying to reconcile a vendor payment that didn't match the invoice, and she pulled the wrong file trying to fix it. And the wrong file turned out to be everything. She sat on it for 9 days. I know because she told me afterward, voice barely above a whisper, that she'd gone home after finding it and couldn't eat dinner. That she'd spent a week telling herself it was a mistake, a filing error. Something with a logical explanation that she was too junior to understand. That she'd almost deleted it twice. That she'd typed out a resignation letter on day 6 and then closed the laptop without sending it. On day 9, she printed 2 copies, put one in a manila folder, and found me in the hallway outside the accounting office at 8:47 p.m. when the floor was nearly empty. She handed it to me with both hands and said, "I don't know if I should be doing this," and walked away before I could form a single word. I took the folder to my car. The first set of financials was the one I'd been seeing every quarter for years. Clean. Professional. The version of Forge and Meridian I thought I'd built. The second set had a different header format. Subtle, easy to miss, and it took me 3 full minutes of reading before the architecture of what I was looking at became clear. Derrick had been drawing a management bonus every single quarter since year 1. Drafted by him. Approved by him. Never surfaced to me. The amounts started modest, $4,000 here, $6,000 there, and grew proportionately with the company. By last year, the quarterly figure was $31,000. 11 years of compounding extraction running silently beneath everything we built together. I sat in that parking garage and did the math on my phone calculator. The total came to just under $890,000. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I called a lawyer. My lawyer's name was Gerald Voss. He was 53, wore the same style of gray suit every time I saw him, and had the energy of a man who had seen every version of human betrayal and stopped being surprised by any of it. I chose him specifically because I didn't want someone who would react emotionally. I needed someone who would just read the architecture and tell me what I was standing in. I laid everything out in his office on a Tuesday morning. The 2 sets of books, the management bonuses, the expense irregularities, the meetings I'd been excluded from for 3 years. He listened without interrupting, made notes in a legal pad with a pen that was almost out of ink. And when I finished, he asked me one question. Does he have any filings in his personal name connected to the business? I didn't know. Gerald pulled the trademark database while I sat across from him. It took 4 minutes. Derrick had filed a trademark on Forge and Meridian's core product name. Our flagship operational framework, the intellectual property that represented 60% of our service revenue. In his personal name. Not the company. Not the partnership. Him. Filed 22 months ago. Approved 7 months ago. Sitting there in the federal database, clean and legal and completely invisible to me because I had never thought to look. Gerald set the printout on the desk between us and let me read it. Then he pulled the second document. A paralegal contact had found a letter of intent filed through Halcyon Capital's acquisition arm, asset sale, Forge and Meridian's operational division, client contracts, and intellectual property, including the trademarked product. transferring to Halcyon for a figure that would have made Derrick very comfortable and left me with the liabilities of a dissolved partnership and no legal claim to the brand I'd spent 11 years building. The closing date was 6 weeks out. Gerald uncapped a new pen and looked at me across the desk. "He didn't just betray you," he said. "He engineered this. The trademark was the foundation. The sale was the exit. You were never meant to see either one." I stared at the letter of intent for a long time. Then I asked Gerald what we were going to do about it. He almost smiled. Gerald gave me one instruction before I left his office that Tuesday. Don't change anything. Don't confront him. Don't go quiet in a way he'll notice. You show up tomorrow exactly the way you showed up yesterday, and you do that every single day until I tell you otherwise. I asked him how long. He said 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3. He needed time to build something that had no exits, not a threat, not leverage. A case so structurally complete that when it landed, Derrick's lawyer would open the folder and immediately start negotiating, instead of fighting, because fighting would only make the exposure worse. So I went back to work. I want you to understand what that required. I sat across from Derrick in our Tuesday pipeline meeting 3 days after learning he had been extracting $890,000 from our company, had trademarked our core product in his personal name, and had signed a letter of intent to sell us to Halcyon Capital without telling me. I sat across from him and talked about Q4 projections and a staffing decision, and whether we should renew a vendor contract. I asked his opinion. I laughed at something he said. I walked out of that meeting with him and stood in the hallway for 4 minutes talking about nothing. And then we went back to our respective offices, and I sat down at my desk and stared at my monitor for a long time before I could start working again. I did that every day for 2 weeks. What I noticed during those 2 weeks was this. Derrick got looser, more relaxed. The closing date was approaching, and from where he was standing, everything was on schedule. I wasn't asking difficult questions. I wasn't behaving like a man who knew anything. So he exhaled. He started coming in a little later. He took a long lunch on a Thursday that I know now was with Halcyon's acquisition lead. He bought Lauren flowers. I saw them on his desk on a Friday afternoon, still wrapped, and I understood without being told that they were celebratory. He thought he was 6 weeks from the finish line. He thought I was still exactly where he needed me, trusting, operational, completely unaware. Meanwhile, Gerald was building. Fraud documentation, breach of fiduciary duty, trademark opposition filed quietly on day 9. Not yet served, just filed, time-stamped, legally positioned. Injunction paperwork was prepared and ready to submit the moment we needed to freeze the asset sale. A forensic accountant's report that itemized 11 years of financial extraction down to the quarter, the amount, and the mechanism Derrick had used to conceal it. On day 13, Gerald called me at 7 p.m. and said 4 words. "We're ready to move." I asked him when. He said the morning of the closing meeting. Let Derrick sit down at that table believing he'd already won. Let him feel the finish line before we took it. I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks. Not because I was happy about what was coming. Because I was finally done waiting. The Halcyon Capital closing meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday in a downtown conference room that Derrick had booked himself. Neutral territory, that was how he'd framed it to me. 2 weeks earlier when he'd mentioned, casually, that he had a preliminary investor conversation that morning and might be in late. Not a closing meeting, a preliminary conversation. He was still managing my perception right up until the last possible hour. I know he arrived at 8:40. I know because Gerald had someone in the lobby. I know he ordered coffee, set up his laptop, shook hands with Halcyon's acquisition lead and their 2 attorneys, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who has already mentally spent the money. I know, because the acquisition lead told us all of this afterward, in detail, with the particular discomfort of someone who realized too late they'd been used as an instrument in someone else's fraud. Gerald and I arrived at 8:57. Derrick looked up when we walked in, and I watched his face move through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. Surprise first, then confusion, then something that wasn't quite fear yet but was standing right next to it. He said, "Callum, what are you?" Gerald set the folder on the conference table before Derrick finished the sentence. "Mr. Hale, I'm Gerald Voss, legal counsel for Callum Voss and Forge and Meridian. You've been served." The folder contained the fraud documentation, the breach of fiduciary duty filing, the forensic accountant's report, 41 pages, every quarter itemized, every extracted dollar traced back to its mechanism, the trademark opposition that had been filed 9 days earlier, and the injunction submitted to the court at 8:15 that morning, legally freezing the asset sale to Halcyon Capital, pending resolution of the partnership dispute. Derrick's attorney wasn't in that room. He'd been told it was a closing meeting. He'd sent a junior associate who took one look at the folder and reached for his phone. Halcyon's lead attorney picked up the injunction document first, read the first page, set it down, picked up the forensic report, read the summary, set it down, looked at Derrick with an expression that was purely professional and completely devastating. "We're going to need to pause this," he said. Not to Gerald, to Derrick. Derrick looked at me across the table for the first time since we'd walked in. Really looked. And I watched him understand in real time that the version of this morning he'd been carrying for 6 weeks, the clean exit, the clean money, the clean disappearance, was gone, not delayed. Gone. He said my name, just my name, like a question. I didn't answer. Gerald was already collecting documents. I pushed my chair back, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of that conference room without looking back. He called me 4 times before I reached the parking garage. I didn't pick up once. The legal process took 14 months. I want to be honest about that, because stories like this have a tendency to compress the aftermath into something clean and satisfying that real life doesn't actually provide. There was nothing clean about it. Some depositions lasted 6 hours. There were mornings I drove to Gerald's office with documents I'd been up until 2 a.m. organizing, and sat across from him, feeling less like someone who'd won something and more like someone slowly dismantling a building they'd spent their entire adult life constructing. But the architecture of what Gerald had built was exactly as airtight as he'd promised. The trademark opposition succeeded. The federal filing established that the intellectual property had been developed entirely within the Forge and Meridian partnership, using partnership resources, partnership staff, and partnership time. Derrick's personal claim dissolved. The product name came back to the company. To me, the fraud case produced a settlement figure that Gerald described as everything he has that isn't bolted down. The $890,000 in extracted management bonuses. The forensic accountant's identification of an additional $340,000 in personal expenses run through company accounts over 9 years. Interest. Legal costs. A structured payment agreement that would follow Derrick for the better part of a decade. The asset sale to Halcyon Capital collapsed completely. Their acquisition lead sent me a brief professional email 6 weeks after the closing meeting, expressing regret about the circumstances. What he meant was that they hadn't known that Derrick had represented the sale as clean and uncontested, and that they wanted distance from the entire situation. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. What I hadn't anticipated was how the information spread. I didn't tell vendors. I didn't tell clients. I didn't make calls or send emails or position myself as the wronged party in any conversation. The court documents were public record, and the people who needed to find them found them. A journalist who covered regional business filed a brief item. 3 of our longest-standing clients called me directly, not to ask questions, just to say they were staying. 2 vendors renegotiated terms in my favor without being asked. The industry is smaller than it looks, and the story told itself without me. Derrick's reputation didn't explode. It drained. Slowly, permanently. The way trust actually leaves, not in a single moment, but in a quiet series of doors closing that never open again. Last I heard, he was consulting independently. Small engagements. Nothing with his name on it. I kept Forge and Meridian, restructured the leadership, promoted Sadie to senior financial analyst. She didn't ask for it. I just left the offer letter on her desk one morning, and she came to find me an hour later with red eyes. And I told her she'd earned it, and that was the end of the conversation. The company is smaller now than it was at its peak. Leaner. Every number I see is a number I trust. That's not a small thing. I used to call Derrick my brother. Now I understand that the word I should have been using the entire time was partner. A word with contracts behind it. A word with obligations attached. A word that means something specific and legal and enforceable in ways that brotherhood never does. I don't miss him. I miss who I thought he was. I miss the version of that partnership that existed in my head for 11 years. The equal footing. The shared sacrifice. The man who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm because that's what you do. But that man was a story Derrick told me. And I'm done living in other people's stories.